Name, date, and place of birth. Let's see. I was born in Moline, Illinois, in 1920. My folks moved to Savannah in that year, and I was the year I was born. And Savannah is a riverboat town. My village was on the Mississippi River, and it was the terminal of two big railroads, the Milwaukee Railroad and the Burlington Railroad. And so they got the river produce that the farmers made, and they had the Milwaukee Railroad and the Burlington Railroads that crossed. They had the best of both all transportation. They had the river transportation and they had the highway transportation, and it was the farm country, and the farmers would bring their produce into this big storage containers along the river. The river barges would come up and the grain would be chuted down from the storage containers down to the river barges. And then the river barges would go down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. And at New Orleans they would be transferred into ocean-going transports, and the grain would be all over the world. It was great sport in the summertime to take a package of food, hop on a railroad train going north along the river. The freight trains would pull off to the siding quite often to let a passenger train go through or to make deliveries. And at one of those stops, we would hop off, walk over just 100 yards or so to the Mississippi River, and then we'd camp out overnight. And we had enough food for supper, and we'd bacon and eggs in the morning. Before we'd make a raft out of the logs, the dead trees along the banks of the Mississippi, and they're loaded with dead trees. And we'd make a raft. We'd hop on this raft and float down the river until we were opposite our hometown, and then we'd abandon the raft and swim to shore, stand in the sun for a few minutes and dry off, and then go home. My dad was a fireman on the railroad, and the next step up was engineer. He gave up the fireman position and went back to switching because switching paid more. The fireman's job on the railroad, whereas it led to a better job as engineer, during the period of a fireman, they got peanuts. So he gave up the fireman job and went to switching, which really had no future, but it paid more money. I remember the Great Depression in the early 30s. It didn't affect my family because my father was employed. My dad had enough seniority on the railroad. He was a switchman, but he would give up 2 or 3 days a week so that somebody else could put food on the table. Also, I had a paper route. My first job was the paper route. I was about 10. Oh, my route was the walking route within the village. Yes, we had a radio. The main station was the Crosley radio station in Ohio. Well, in the middle and late 20s, we could buy radio kits and build a receiver. My father and I built it together. When refrigerators were first introduced in the late 1920s and early 30s, they were a combination because almost everybody had an ice box, and the ice would be delivered with an iceman in the streets of the village. And so I remember ice being cut in the river and stored in ice houses in sawdust. And then in the summertime, they'd be delivered through the streets of the village by horse wagons. There's the one that I wrecked. This was a 1935 Ford.
It was your father's car?
Yes. First car?
Yeah.
My first car was my dad's car.
Yes, he wasn't very happy about that, huh?
No, they weren't.
What did he have to say about that?
The car was a complete wreck. I'm not sure, but it was 10 or 12 cents a gallon. Hoover and Roosevelt were the only ones I remember. Well, the Depression started at the end of Hoover's presidency. And that was when Roosevelt came in, and that was about the same time that World War II started. North of where I was born and raised was a national park. During the period of the Depression, people who were out of jobs were brought to these national parks as work crews. They received a subsistence living and salary, and they also created and cleaned up the national parks. We had work crews who were Depression people. They would come out and rehabilitate national parks as one of the projects to keep people employed. It sort of was a bridge the gap during the days of the Depression. They had what they called the CMTC camps, civilian military training camps, and instead of people just hanging out in the streets, they bring groups of men to these camps to do rehabilitation work, whatever it was. Where I come from, there was the national park.
Yeah.
We had the river, the railroads, and the national monuments and the national parks, and they build up these parks and put in pedestrian bridges and like hotels where people could come and at a very low cost could stay there and visit the national parks.
Do you have a...
My first gun was was what we call a .22. The shells were a caliber .22. And later on, the larger caliber guns came on the market, but I got my first .22 when I was I think I was 12 or 13 years old. We'd use it for target practicing down in the local dump. Every village had a dump where they dumped all their garbage. And we'd go down there and shoot rats with a .22 caliber. After high school?
Yeah, after high school. What did your friends do?
Well, a good number of them went on to college. Those who didn't go to college were hired on the railroads, the Milwaukee Railroad and the Burlington Railroad.
So your plans for after high school, you left Savannah and went to Chicago, right?
Yes, I left Savannah and went to Chicago, and I went to an aviation school.
Were you always interested in flying growing up? When you were growing up, were you always interested in flying?
Yes.
Had you ever flown in an airplane?
Only as a passenger, and once when I was, I don't know, about 8 or 10 years old, I remember my uncle took me for a flight in Moline, Illinois. That was my first flight in a plane. I was working for the Sperry Company, and the Sperry Company manufactured products in the aeronautical, marine, and so-called fire control fields. And they had schools where they brought in customers into these schools, train these customers' personnel in the use of all of these products. As I mentioned before, my supervisor got mixed up with fast women and slow horses, and for about a year, while the two of them were off satisfying their love life, I was running the department. And when the company finally caught up with the two of them, they fired both of them. And that was when I was put in charge of these three departments, because I had been running them anyway. Grandma was one of the replacements for the nurse. You see, these schools were located in one building, and they had a little dispensary, and Grandma was the nurse in one of these dispensaries, and that's how our paths crossed. I had a cold.
You had a cold.
I went to the dispensary just to get my throat sprayed. That was when this nurse was in charge of the dispensary. I opened my mouth and she walked into it, and we got married. And with the war on, there was no such thing as you go away for a honeymoon. We had one day together.